The summer of 1941 dawned with an ominous quiet across the vast plains of Eastern Europe. For months, intelligence reports had whispered of a monumental gathering of forces, a military build-up unprecedented in scope. Yet, even as the storm clouds gathered, a profound sense of disbelief, even denial, gripped many. Then, on June 22, the silence shattered. Operation Barbarossa, the code name for Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, commenced with a ferocity that defied imagination. Millions of men, thousands of tanks, and endless artillery barrages tore through the Soviet frontier, marking the beginning of a conflict that would define the century. History records the brutal reality of that invasion, the initial, staggering German successes, the desperate Soviet resistance, and ultimately, the turning of the tide at the gates of Moscow and the frozen fields of Stalingrad. The Soviet Union, though grievously wounded, survived, and played a decisive role in the eventual Allied victory. But what if? What if the unthinkable had happened? What if the Wehrmacht's initial lightning thrust had not faltered? What if Moscow had fallen, Leningrad been starved into submission, and the industrial heartland of the Urals laid bare to German conquest? This is the alternate history we explore today. In this alternate timeline, we delve into a world irrevocably altered by a successful Operation Barbarossa. We examine the immediate aftermath, the political convulsions, the humanitarian catastrophe, and the geopolitical earthquake that would ripple across the globe. The very fabric of the 20th century, as we know it, would be rewoven. From the chilling prospect of a Nazi-dominated Eastern Europe to the desperate strategies devised in Washington and London, from the shifted ambitions of Imperial Japan to the long-term economic and cultural legacies, we chart a path into a darker, more complex reality. A reality where the hammer and sickle fell, and a new, terrible order rose in its place. This is not merely an exercise in speculative fiction, but a profound exploration of the fragility of history and the immense consequences of pivotal moments. The success of Barbarossa would not have simply ended a war. It would have fundamentally reshaped the trajectory of humanity. Join us as we journey into this chilling what-if, peeling back the layers of a world that almost was, a world where the brutal logic of total war reached its ultimate, horrific conclusion in the East. The morning of June 22, 1941, saw the largest land invasion in human history unleash its fury upon the Soviet Union. 3 massive army groups, North, Center, and South, totaling over 3 million Axis soldiers, spearheaded the assault. The element of surprise, despite countless warnings, was largely achieved. Stalin, caught in a self-imposed delusion of non-aggression-pact security, had dismissed intelligence as provocations. Soviet forward defenses were ill-prepared, their command structure hobbled by purges, and their forces often poorly equipped or deployed in vulnerable positions. The initial breakthrough was immediate and devastating. Army Group Center, the most powerful of the 3, tore through Belarus with astonishing speed. Its panzer divisions, masters of blitzkrieg tactics, sliced through Soviet lines, creating vast encirclements. In the first week alone, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured or killed. The scale of the catastrophe was immense. Minsk fell within days, a strategic hub collapsing with shocking rapidity, opening the path further east. The traditional narrative holds that German logistics, the vastness of the Soviet Union, and ultimately the fierce Soviet resistance and the brutal Russian winter, were the Wehrmacht's undoing. But in this alternate timeline, certain key factors played out differently. One crucial divergence lay in the initial strategic decisions of the Soviet High Command. Instead of ordering a rigid defense in depth, which would have allowed for tactical retreats and regrouping, Stalin insisted on a forward defense, throwing poorly organized counterattacks directly into the teeth of the German advance. This stubborn adherence to flawed doctrine resulted in even larger encirclements and the destruction of more frontline armies than historically occurred. The sheer speed of the German advance meant that fewer Soviet forces could be withdrawn behind the Dnieper River line. Army Group North, targeting Leningrad, also achieved faster progress. While the historical siege still occurred, the swift collapse of Soviet defenses around the Baltic states meant vital supply lines to Leningrad were cut earlier and more decisively. In the south, Army Group South, aided by Romanian and Hungarian allies, pushed through Ukraine with similar success, though against fiercer initial resistance. The rich agricultural lands and industrial centers of Kharkov and Donbass became primary objectives. The historical pivot point, the German decision to divert panzer groups south from Army Groups Center to aid the push into Ukraine and the encirclement of Kiev, still occurred. However, in this timeline, the diversion was less impactful on the drive toward Moscow. The difference came from the sheer scale of the Soviet collapse further north. With less resistance to the immediate front of Army Group Center, the diversion of forces for the Kiev encirclement did not significantly delay the main thrust. A crucial element in this alternate success was a more benign weather pattern. The heavy autumn rains, the Rasputitsa, which historically bogged down German logistics and turned roads into impassable quagmires, arrived later and was less severe. This allowed the German supply trains, already stretched, to maintain a slightly better pace. While still facing immense challenges, the logistical choke points that historically paralyzed the advance in October and November were mitigated. Furthermore, a key alteration involved the intelligence failures on the Soviet side regarding Japanese intentions. Historically, Stalin was able to move vital Siberian divisions west to defend Moscow only after confirming Japan would not attack from the east. In this alternate timeline, perhaps due to a subtle shift in Japanese diplomacy or a more aggressive stance from Tokyo towards Soviet Far East territories, Stalin remained convinced of a credible threat from Japan. The Siberian divisions stayed in place. The absence of these elite, well-trained and well-equipped units from the defense of Moscow was catastrophic. These were the soldiers who, historically, had blunted the final German push on the capital in December 1941. By late October and early November, Army Group Center, though weary and depleted, found itself within striking distance of Moscow. The weather was cold, but the paralyzing blizzards and extreme temperatures that would historically cripple the Germans had not yet arrived with full force. The Soviet defenses around Moscow, while heroic, lacked the numerical strength and strategic reserves that saved the city in our own history. The city was a sprawling, ill-prepared fortress, but without the crucial reinforcements, its fate was sealed. The battle for the capital would be savage, a brutal house-to-house struggle unlike any seen before. Yet the momentum, the slightly improved logistics, and the absence of critical Soviet reserves tilted the balance. The historical narrative speaks of German troops seeing the spires of the Kremlin before being forced back. In this alternate reality, they would go further. The city, though defended with unimaginable bravery, began to succumb. The fall of Moscow, once deemed impossible by many, became an agonizing reality. The symbolic and strategic heart of the Soviet Union was breached, not by a single, decisive blow, but by a relentless, grinding advance that finally overwhelmed its defenders. The fall of Moscow was not a swift, surgical strike, but a brutal, prolonged assault that culminated in early December 1941. German forces, though severely weakened by months of campaigning, finally breached the inner defenses. Street fighting was ferocious, each block, each building contested with grim determination. The city, historically a bastion of Soviet resistance, now became a graveyard. Casualties on both sides were astronomical. Yet the superior German combined arms tactics, coupled with the absence of the fresh Siberian reserves that historically saved the city, eventually tipped the scales. On December 5, 1941, German tanks, battered but triumphant, reached Red Square. The sight of the swastika flying over the Kremlin was an unimaginable psychological blow, not just to the Soviet people, but to the entire world. Stalin's personal fate in this alternate timeline is a subject of intense speculation. Historically, he remained in Moscow, a defiant symbol of resistance. In this reality, the rapid advance and the complete breakdown of command in the final days of the battle likely forced his hand. One plausible scenario sees him attempting a desperate retreat east, perhaps toward Kazan or Kuibyshev, where elements of the government had already been evacuated. However, the chaos of the rout and the relentless German pursuit would have made such an escape incredibly perilous. Another, more dramatic, possibility involves his capture or even death. A German propaganda coup of immense proportions would follow the capture of the Soviet leader, demoralizing the remaining resistance. Regardless of Stalin's immediate fate, the political consequences of Moscow's fall were catastrophic for the Soviet state. The very legitimacy of the Communist Party and its leadership was shattered. The central nervous system of the Soviet Union had been severed. The historical unity forged by the invasion, the great patriotic war narrative, would have been severely undermined. Disparate elements within the vast Soviet Empire, some resentful of Moscow's rule, might have seen an opportunity in the collapse. The command structure of the Red Army, already reeling from purges and initial defeats, would have fragmented further. Regional commanders, cut off from central authority, would have been forced to make independent decisions, leading to a patchwork of desperate resistance, surrender, or even defection. Leningrad, still under siege, would have faced an even more desperate situation. With Moscow fallen, the hope of relief would have vanished, and the resolve of its defenders, already pushed to the brink, would have been severely tested. The city's eventual fall, either to starvation or direct assault, would have become inevitable. With Moscow gone, the fragmented Soviet leadership would have attempted to establish a new capital, perhaps in the Urals or even further east. But without the central authority and symbolic power of Moscow, such a government would have struggled for legitimacy and control. The industrial evacuation to the Urals and Siberia, a monumental achievement in our timeline, would have been less successful in this alternate reality. The speed of the German advance, particularly in Ukraine and the Donbass, would have curtailed the time available for dismantling and transporting vital factories. Furthermore, the morale of the workers and engineers, faced with the fall of the capital and the apparent collapse of the state, would have been severely impacted, making the heroic efforts of relocation far more difficult to achieve. The ensuing winter, while still cold, would have been less of a strategic advantage for the Soviets. With Moscow as a German winter headquarters, and critical supply lines further west secured, the Wehrmacht would have been able to consolidate their gains and prepare for the spring offensive with greater effectiveness. The sheer size of the Soviet Union meant that pockets of resistance would have continued. Partisan warfare, already a feature of the conflict, would have intensified, particularly in the vast forests and marshes. But without a unified command, these efforts would have been isolated and ultimately less effective. The psychological impact on the German leadership and soldiers would have been immense. The rapid, decisive victory they had always sought, the complete destruction of Bolshevism, seemed within their grasp. This would have fueled their confidence, perhaps leading to even greater atrocities and ruthlessness in the occupied territories. With the heart of the Soviet Union captured, Hitler's attention would undoubtedly turn to the vast resources of the Caucasus oil fields. The path south, though challenging, would have been cleared of major organized resistance. The remaining Soviet forces in the south, demoralized and cut off, would have faced an impossible situation. The historical battles for Stalingrad and the Caucasus, iconic struggles of resistance, would have been rendered moot, or fought under vastly different, more desperate circumstances. The world would have watched in horror and disbelief as one of the great powers of the early 20th century was utterly annihilated. The implications for the rest of Europe, and indeed the world, were monumental. The geopolitical landscape was permanently reshaped. With Moscow fallen and the Soviet state in disarray, the German occupation of Eastern Europe escalated to a scale unmatched in modern history. The vast territories, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea and deep into Russia proper, were not merely conquered, they were to be utterly reordered according to Nazi ideology. Hitler's vision for the East, encapsulated in the infamous General Plan Ost, was one of ruthless colonization and demographic transformation. This plan, historically only partially implemented due to the war's outcome, would now be accelerated and enforced with brutal efficiency. Millions of Slavs were to be forcibly removed, enslaved, or exterminated to make way for German settlers. The fertile lands of Ukraine, the industrial resources of the Donbass, and the strategic breadth of the Russian plain were all destined for German exploitation. The agricultural wealth of the Black Earth region was immediately plundered to feed the Third Reich, contributing to the historical famines that devastated the occupied territories. Millions more would perish from forced labor, disease, and systematic starvation. Infrastructure was rapidly adapted for German use, with railways being converted to standard gauge and new roads built to facilitate the movement of troops and resources. Cities became administrative centers for the occupation, their populations under strict control. The initial phase of occupation saw the establishment of Reichskommissariats, vast administrative zones designed to govern the conquered territories. Erich Koch's brutal rule in Ukraine, historically a harbinger of the regime's intentions, would now be mirrored across the entire occupied East. Repression was immediate and absolute. Any form of dissent, any act of sabotage, any perceived challenge to German authority was met with swift and disproportionate retribution. Public executions and massacres became a common tool of terror. The Holocaust, already underway in the occupied territories, would intensify with even greater ferocity. With the total collapse of the Soviet state, the Jewish populations of Eastern Europe faced an even more direct and unhindered path to extermination. Collaboration also became a complex and widespread phenomenon. Nationalistic groups, particularly in the Baltic states and Ukraine, initially viewed the Germans as liberators from Soviet rule. Many eagerly joined local auxiliary police units and paramilitary formations. These collaborators, fueled by anti-Soviet sentiment and promises of independent statehood, promises that were rarely, if ever, fulfilled, played a significant role in enforcing German rule and participating in atrocities against Jews and other perceived enemies. However, the brutal reality of German occupation, the disregard for local aspirations, and the systematic exploitation soon turned many potential allies into bitter enemies. The initial honeymoon period quickly soured. Resistance, though fragmented and facing overwhelming odds, was inevitable. Partisan movements, initially disorganized remnants of the Red Army and local Communist Party cadres, would grow in size and sophistication, driven by desperation and a thirst for vengeance. Without a unified Soviet state to provide direction and resupply, these partisan groups would have relied heavily on capturing German equipment and living off the land, making them even more ruthless in their dealings with the local population. The vastness of the occupied territory, the harsh climate, and the sheer number of disaffected individuals ensured that Germany would never truly pacify the entire East. It would remain a festering wound, draining resources and manpower. German anti-partisan operations, historically brutal, would intensify in this alternate reality. Entire villages would be razed, civilians executed en masse, and vast sweeps conducted, turning large swathes of the countryside into scorched earth. The Germans also sought to create a new, compliant intellectual class. Educational institutions were either closed or repurposed to teach German language and culture, indoctrinating the next generation into the Nazi worldview. However, cultural resistance would also emerge. Underground schools, clandestine religious services, and the circulation of forbidden literature would become acts of defiance, preserving a sense of identity against overwhelming oppression. The occupation of the East would become a perpetual burden for the Third Reich. It would require an enormous commitment of manpower and resources to maintain control, diverting forces that could have been used on other fronts. This draining commitment would subtly but profoundly impact Germany's ability to wage war elsewhere, making the dream of a dominant European empire an increasingly difficult and costly endeavor, even with the vast resources extracted from the East. The news of Moscow's fall sent shockwaves across the globe, but nowhere was the impact more acutely felt than in Washington, D.C. and London. For President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill, the strategic landscape of the Second World War had been fundamentally and catastrophically altered. Historically, the Soviet Union's resilience bought precious time for the Western Allies. It bled the Wehrmacht dry, forcing Hitler to fight a devastating two-front war. With the USSR effectively out of the picture, the entire calculus of the conflict shifted overnight. In London, Churchill would have been devastated. The prospect of a triumphant Nazi Germany dominating the entirety of Eastern Europe, with its vast resources and manpower, was a nightmarish scenario. Britain, already isolated, would face an even more formidable foe. The argument for opening a second front, in Western Europe, already a contentious issue, would become even more urgent, yet also infinitely more difficult. Without the Soviet drain on German resources, any cross-channel invasion would face the full might of the Wehrmacht. For President Roosevelt, the fall of Moscow underscored the immediate danger to global democracy. Lend-Lease aid, historically flowing to the Soviet Union, would now need to be redirected. Britain would receive even more vital supplies, but the primary bulwark against Nazism in the East was gone. The United States, still reeling from Pearl Harbor and fully engaged in the Pacific, would face immense pressure to accelerate its own military buildup and intervention in Europe. Isolationist sentiments, though waning, would briefly resurface as the sheer scale of the Nazi triumph sank in. The strategic debate in Washington would intensify. Should the focus remain on Japan, or should the bulk of American power be immediately directed toward Europe to prevent a complete Nazi hegemony? The Germany first strategy would face its ultimate test. Lend-Lease aid to Britain and, to a lesser extent, China, would be dramatically increased. Roosevelt would push even harder for American industrial output to become the arsenal of democracy, understanding that time was now shorter than ever. Diplomatic efforts would also accelerate. Latin American nations would be pressured to fully align with the Allies, and neutrality would become an increasingly untenable position. The global chess board had been fundamentally altered, and every piece now mattered more than before. The intelligence communities in both the US and Britain would have been gripped by frantic analyses, trying to predict Germany's next move. Would Hitler consolidate his gains and turn west? Would he pursue the Middle Eastern oil fields? The fear of a direct attack on Britain, though lessened by air superiority, would resurface. The development of atomic weapons, already a top-secret project, would gain even greater urgency. The prospect of Nazi Germany, with its expanded industrial base and scientific talent, developing a nuclear deterrent would be a terrifying motivator. Propaganda efforts in the West would shift, no longer focusing on the heroic Soviet resistance, but instead on the existential threat of Nazi domination. The war would be framed as a fight for the very survival of freedom and civilization. The European resistance movements, particularly in France, Poland, and Yugoslavia, would receive increased aid and covert support. While no longer able to count on a large Eastern front, their disruption of German logistics and sabotage would be seen as crucial. The strategic bombing campaigns against Germany would be intensified earlier and with greater ferocity. The goal would be to cripple German industry and morale, hoping to weaken the heart of the Third Reich before a direct invasion could be mounted. However, this strategy would come at a high cost. Without the constant threat from the east, Germany could redeploy more anti-aircraft defenses and fighter squadrons to the west, making the skies over Europe even deadlier for Allied aircrews. The invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch, would still occur, possibly even earlier, as a vital stepping stone to this soft underbelly of Europe. Securing the Mediterranean would become even more paramount to protect supply routes and open new fronts. Ultimately, the fall of Moscow would force the Western Allies to confront a stronger, more confident Nazi Germany. The war would be longer, bloodier, and more uncertain, with the ultimate outcome hanging precariously in the balance. The psychological toll on the Allied leadership and populations would be immense. The dream of a swift victory, already distant, would now be replaced by the grim reality of a prolonged struggle against an apparently unstoppable totalitarian power. The world would hold its breath. The successful conclusion of Operation Barbarossa would not only redraw the map of Europe, its seismic reverberations would shake the foundations of power across Asia and the Pacific. Imperial Japan, Germany's Axis partner, would find its strategic calculus profoundly altered. Historically, Japan's decision to strike south into Southeast Asia and against Pearl Harbor was influenced by several factors, not least the immense strain the Sino-Japanese War placed on resources and the perceived threat of the Soviet Union to its north. In this alternate timeline, with the Soviet Union collapsing under the German onslaught, the strategic threat from Siberia, which had historically tied down significant Guandong army forces, would largely vanish. The possibility of a Soviet counterattack would be negligible. This newfound security on its northern flank would present Japan with a critical choice. Would it seize the opportunity to invade the weakened Soviet Far East, rich in natural resources, or would it continue its historical drive south for oil and rubber? A decisive factor would be the German insistence. Hitler, having conquered European Russia, would undoubtedly press Japan to join his vision of a global anti-communist alliance and exploit the vast resources of Siberia. Promises of vast territorial gains stretching to the Urals would be dangled. Tokyo's military leadership, particularly the faction advocating for a northern expansion, would gain considerable sway. The perceived easy gains of a dismembered Siberia, free from American naval interdiction, might seem more appealing than a costly war against the United States and Britain. If Japan were to invade the Soviet Far East, this would fundamentally alter the Pacific War. Pearl Harbor and the subsequent push south might be delayed, or even entirely avoided. American forces would not be immediately drawn into a devastating two-ocean war. Instead, Japan would commit its considerable land forces to a northern campaign. The Siberian cities of Vladivostok and Khabarovsk, along with the vast natural resources of the region, would become their primary objectives. This would free up significant U.S. and British resources for the European theater. Without a major Pacific offensive to counter the Germany first strategy could be implemented with greater force and speed, potentially shifting the balance in the West. However, this scenario carries its own set of complications. A victorious Germany and Japan carving up the Eurasian landmass would present a combined Axis threat of unprecedented scale, forcing the Allies to fight a truly global war of containment against two entrenched empires. China, already embroiled in a brutal war with Japan, would find its situation even more desperate. With no Soviet aid and Japan's northern flank secure, Japanese forces could exert even greater pressure, potentially leading to a more complete collapse of Chinese resistance. The British Empire's possessions in Asia, though still vulnerable, might gain a temporary reprieve from immediate Japanese invasion if Tokyo focused on Siberia. However, this would be short-lived. The eventual clash with Britain, and by extension the US, was likely inevitable given Japanese expansionist ambitions. The end of the Soviet threat would also free up German resources to potentially assist Japan in the Pacific. While direct naval assistance was unlikely, advanced German technology, U-boat deployments in the Indian Ocean, or coordinated strategic planning could pose new challenges. India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, would become even more critical. It would serve as the primary staging ground for any future Allied efforts against a Japan entrenched in Southeast Asia or a German-dominated Middle East. The colonial subjects across Asia, from India to Indochina, would find themselves caught between competing imperial powers. Nationalistic movements, historically looking to the Allies for liberation, might find themselves weighing the option of siding with Japan against the Western powers. The wider imperial consequences are staggering. A world where Germany and Japan carve up Eurasia means a direct challenge to the remaining British, French, and Dutch empires. The era of Western global dominance would be definitively and violently ended. The post-war world, historically shaped by the rise of two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, would instead be dominated by a victorious Axis, or by a vastly prolonged struggle against them. The Cold War, as we know it, would never have transpired. The successful conclusion of Operation Barbarossa, followed by the complete collapse and occupation of the Soviet Union, would unleash a torrent of consequences that would redefine the entire long 20th century. Economic, cultural, and geopolitical legacies would stretch far beyond the initial conflict. Economically, Germany would become the undisputed hegemon of Eurasia. The vast agricultural lands of Ukraine, the oil fields of the Caucasus, and the mineral wealth of the Urals would all be brought under direct German control and exploitation. This influx of resources, combined with the forced labor of millions, would fuel the Nazi war machine and consumer economy for decades. Germany's industrial capacity, already formidable, would swell to unprecedented levels, unburdened by a continuous Eastern front. However, this prosperity would be built on the brutal subjugation of entire peoples. The scale of the humanitarian disaster in Eastern Europe, with millions forcibly displaced, enslaved, or starved, would be unparalleled. A new caste system, with Germans at the apex, would be enforced. The world economy would be irrevocably split. A self-sufficient, powerful German bloc dominating Eurasia, potentially allied with Japan in Asia, would stand in stark contrast to the Western capitalist economies of the United States and a diminished British Empire. Culturally, the impact would be devastating. Russian and other Slavic cultures would be systematically suppressed, their languages marginalized, their history rewritten. Germanization programs, aimed at creating a subservient population, would be widespread. Education in the occupied territories would be limited to basic skills and German propaganda. The rich artistic, scientific, and literary traditions of Russia would wither under the heel of totalitarian control. This cultural void would be filled by Nazi ideology, promoting racial purity, aggressive nationalism, and a cult of personality around Hitler. Generations would be raised under a brutal, dystopian regime, with profound psychological and social consequences. Geopolitically, the world would be forever changed. The Cold War, as we know it, between the United States and the Soviet Union, would never occur. Instead, a new, far more dangerous global confrontation would emerge, one between an expanded, victorious Axis and the remaining democratic powers. The United Nations, historically founded on the principle of collective security against totalitarianism, would be a vastly different organization, if it existed at all. A world dominated by expansionist empires would leave little room for international cooperation. The nuclear age, if it still dawned, would be infinitely more terrifying. The race for atomic weapons would involve not just the US and potentially Britain, but also a resource-rich Germany, capable of pouring immense resources into such a project. The post-war decolonization movement would be profoundly affected. Without the weakened state of European colonial powers after fighting the Soviet Union, and with the rise of new imperial powers, the path to independence for many nations would be far longer and bloodier. The nature of military power would also evolve. While air and naval power would remain crucial for the West, Germany would emphasize vast land armies, armored divisions, and a highly organized logistical network to maintain control over its continental empire. Technological development would continue, but with a distinct ideological slant. German scientific research would focus on military applications, racial hygiene, and control mechanisms, potentially leading to advanced surveillance and repression technologies. The intellectual and artistic centers of the world would shift. Many European intellectuals and artists would have fled to the United States or other free nations, creating a diaspora that would enrich Western culture while impoverishing a continent under authoritarian rule. The memory of the Soviet Union, if allowed to exist at all, would be distorted and demonized by German propaganda. Any lingering resistance or historical narrative would be actively suppressed, creating a sanitized, false history. In this chilling alternate future, the world would forever bear the scars of a German victory in the East. It would be a century defined by expansionist totalitarianism, widespread suffering, and a constant, simmering global tension. The trajectory of human progress, freedom, and cooperation would have been tragically diverted. The journey through this alternate history, where Operation Barbarossa succeeded, leaves us with a chilling reflection. The world we've explored is one profoundly reshaped, where the triumph of a single, brutal ideology cast a long, dark shadow over the entire 20th century, and likely beyond. It is a stark reminder of the immense stakes of World War II. Our own history saw the Soviet Union, despite unimaginable losses, hold the line and ultimately push back the Nazi tide, ensuring that a truly global totalitarian empire never came to fruition. In this parallel world, the Soviet collapse meant the loss of a crucial, if brutal, ally. It forced the Western democracies to face a Germany unburdened by a two-front war, a Germany that commanded the vast resources of an entire continent. The struggle would have been infinitely harder, the outcome far more uncertain. The human cost in this alternate reality is almost unimaginable. The systematic subjugation, enslavement, and extermination plan for Eastern Europe would have been executed on an unprecedented scale, dwarfing the already horrific atrocities of our own timeline. Millions more would have perished, their histories erased. The geopolitical landscape would be utterly alien to us. No Cold War between superpowers. Instead, a world possibly locked in a protracted, existential struggle between a triumphant, expansionist axis and a defensive, beleaguered Western bloc. The dream of a united, peaceful Europe would have been stillborn. This thought experiment is not merely about alternative military outcomes, but about the profound moral and ethical choices made by nations and individuals. It underscores the fragility of freedom and the devastating consequences when it is lost. The triumph of Barbarossa would have demonstrated the horrifying effectiveness of unchecked ideological power, forever altering the course of scientific, cultural, and social development. Innovation would be channeled into control, art into propaganda, and dissent into oblivion. So, as we return to our own history, we gain a renewed appreciation for the pivotal moments that shaped our world. The mud and snow outside Moscow, the frozen fields of Stalingrad, the desperate courage of countless Soviet citizens, these were not just battles, but turning points that saved humanity from a truly dystopian fate. The what-if of a successful Barbarossa serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of vigilance against totalitarianism, the value of international cooperation, and the enduring human spirit that, even in the darkest of times, refuses to be extinguished. It teaches us that history is not predetermined, but rather a complex tapestry woven from countless decisions, acts of heroism, and moments of despair. The threads of our past, however painful, contain crucial lessons for navigating the challenges of our future. And in understanding what almost was, we can better understand and cherish the world that is. A world where, despite its imperfections, the forces of freedom ultimately prevailed against the darkest ambitions of conquest.